Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first fall 2021 Bulkley Valley Research Center seminar series. It's great to have you all here, and a special welcome to Kari. Thanks so much for kicking us off this fall. It's great to host you. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm hosting today from the traditional territory of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation on the banks of the Bulkley River. The Bulkley Valley Research Center would like to thank our supportive funders, Bulkley Valley Community Foundation and Bulkley Valley Credit Union, as well as persons, including many of yourselves who have purchased memberships to the center. Your membership directly supports events such as the seminar series and allows us to provide a forum for researchers and practitioners and professionals to share their knowledge and experience with others in a very low cost accessible environment, which we really value at the center. There are many of you that are new today to our first seminar, I believe, and welcome. It's great to have you here. For those of you not familiar with the Research Center, we are physically located in Smithers, and we support research into natural resources management throughout Northwest BC. And the center has been in operation for 20 years. We have a great website that lists projects and abstracts and researchers and things that we have happening, bvcenter.ca. Please do take a look and check it out. And with that, I'd like to welcome Kari. Kari Stuart-Smith is Manager of Biodiversity and Wildlife at Canfor's Canadian Woodlands Operations. She has over 25 years of experience in the forest industry in Western Canada, holds a PhD and a Master's of Science. Kari has extensive history of successful collaboration and project leadership with government, Indigenous nations, industry, academia, and stakeholders throughout BC in the development of evidence-based legislation and forest management strategies to conserve biodiversity and wildlife habitat. She's authored numerous scientific publications on wildlife, including moose, mountain goat, caribou, northern goshawk, and songbirds, and she was appointed to BC's First Minister's Wildlife Advisory Council last year. Welcome, Kari.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I am very pleased and honored to have been asked to give a presentation for this series. This will be a slightly different type of talk than I think you're used to seeing here, because rather than focus on one topic or study, I'm including a quick look at a variety of the work that I've been fortunate enough to have been a part of over the past 25 years or so. And one of the things that I would like to emphasize is that other than my PhD work, all of this work has been collaborative. I've made a strong effort over the years to reach out and involve people from governments, environmental groups, Indigenous nations, industry, academia, and others, with the view that incorporating many different perspectives and types of knowledge produces a stronger end product and one that is more likely to be implemented in the field. We'll start with a look at my PhD work, which examined one of the key concepts behind BC's approach to maintaining biodiversity in managed forests, the historic disturbance hypothesis. This assumes that native species have persisted through or adapted to the disturbance regimes of the Holocene. So the more closely forestry can emulate the patterns and processes of natural disturbance, like wildfire, the closer we'll get to maintaining biodiversity. While there are obvious differences between wildfire and logging, such as snags and roads, for example, forest management could emulate some of the characteristics of natural disturbances, such as the rate of return, the size and spatial distribution, and the severity of disturbance. And for this project, I chose to focus on the severity, as indexed by the density of live or residual trees remaining post-disturbance. I conducted this work in the Rockies, southeast of Invermere, over 3 years. I surveyed songbirds using point counts in 166 burned or logged stands that varied in age from 7 to 45 years post-disturbance, and with densities of dispersed residual trees from 0 to about 20% of the original stand. I also monitored natural and artificial bird nests for breeding success, although I won't discuss that today. And over the course of the study, I made over 20,000 detections of 81 different species of birds. A high degree of overlap between the bird communities in both disturbance types. disturbance explaining less than 15% of the variation between communities. Log stands had actually a higher abundance of birds in both of the Beck variants, with more species reaching their highest densities in log stands, but community composition and species richness was similar between the stand types. And as time since disturbance increased, bird communities in the ESSF became more similar, while those in the MS became less so. These patterns are strongly influenced by the density of residual trees. Residual broadleaf trees were positively associated with both total bird abundance and richness, and of the 9 species whose density was significantly related to them, 8 responded positively and only 1 negatively. Residual conifer overstory trees had a similarly strong positive effect on both abundance and richness, but species responded in both positive and negative fashions to them. Conifer understory trees, by contrast, did not significantly affect total richness or abundance, but did positively influence the densities of 3 species. That's in the MS. In the ESSF, however, the understory residuals were strongly associated with bird communities, with almost all species responses being positive. And the lack of response to conifer overstory in the ESSF and the lack of broadleaf residuals there just reflects a lack of both of these residual types in that Beck variant in either the burned or the log stands at the time that I was doing my study. So essentially, the residual trees were helping to shape the early seral bird community, with open country species like Wilson's warbler and McGilvery's warbler reaching their highest densities in shrubby younger clearcuts, while birds like ruby-crowned kinglets and Townsend's warblers were using blocks with higher densities of residual trees, where they would come and feed on spruce budworms and also sometimes nest in the residual trees. While species that feed on insects associated with broadleaf trees, like the black-capped chickadee and warbling vireo, were using cut blocks in which those trees were left standing and encouraged to persist. So one of the key messages that I got from this was that variability is key, and that managers can use residual trees as a tool to influence songbird communities in harvested areas. To bring these results full circle and have them hit the ground, I developed a brochure for both field staff and loggers and led field tours for prescribing foresters and others in the region. I also spent a lot of time in active cut blocks with operators, discussing the results and learning what was possible to implement and what wasn't. With a strong buy-in from the company at the time, there was a significant increase in retention within cut blocks over the following years. Canfor's habitat biologist, Mark Finney, and I are currently updating this brochure to make it applicable to Canfor's central divisions around Prince George and Vanderhoof and Houston to help assist with in-block retention there. But in this brochure, I focused exclusively on log stands and didn't consider salvage logging. And at the time, although it seems kind of funny to me now, logging was considered to have replaced wildfire as the dominant disturbance in the Rockies. And we hadn't had a significant fire for roughly 20 years. So the issue wasn't top of mind. But then came the summer of 2017. As you know, 2017, followed by 2018, were the worst fire seasons on record in BC, with roughly 1.2 and 1.35 million hectares burned respectively. 2021 is now in 3rd place. Wildfire has both positive and negative effects on wildlife habitat in the short term. Severe fires can result in a loss of snow interception and security cover for ungulates, as well as increased vulnerability for hunted populations. Obviously, there's an immediate loss of old and mature forest habitat and an impact on movement for species through stands with lots of blowdown or fall down. And on the other hand, wildfire creates early seral habitat for many species, including fire specialists like blackback woodpecker, and it also increases herb, shrub, and berry production, which benefits many species from songbirds to grizzly bears. But traditional salvage logging, as I'll call it, included extensive removal of burned and intermixed green timber, often right from the stream bank to as high up in the mountainsides as possible. And in the past, little attention was paid to the value of the dead trees as wildlife habitat, and even less to the drainage, erosion, and sediment control. But research from programs such as the National For Water Program, of which Canfor is a member, has shown that salvage logging actually has compound influence on total stream sediments and turbidity than does just wildfire or logging on its own. And so research like this has really demonstrated that special mitigative practices are needed in salvaged areas in order to maintain things like water quality. And in addition to wildlife habitat and water quality, there's many other considerations in fire salvage that a company has to consider, such as fir and spruce bark beetles, soil compaction, the probability of establishment of invasive plants, the creation of more access, et cetera, et cetera. So the question for me and the others at Canfor at the time, just after the fires in 2017, was how do we salvage this burned wood without impacting the many values provided by the burned landscapes? And just as a note, this was before the guidance released by the Chief Forester, or that's been put out by the Chief Forester on salvage logging was released. So we were sort of operating a bit in the dark at this point. So to develop this guidance, I developed a collaborative science-based approach. And the first step was to review the science on fires and salvage logging and take a look at the BMPs that other jurisdictions developed and get input from specialists, including soil scientists, hydrologists, and wildlife biologists, as well as Indigenous nations and stakeholders. And then as soon as the airspace was open and it was safe, we began touring the fires by air and foot to get a good sense of what happened with the ground. And based on these, I developed guidance for our foresters and logging supervisors. And the overall goal of this guidance was to maintain the variability in habitats that wildfire creates and to mitigate the impacts of salvage logging on soils and water quality and quantity. I'll share a few of these strategies with you today. The first is to reserve all live and lightly burned patches within the fire boundary. The objectives here are to provide some cover and habitat for wildlife, to move water from the soil while the burn is regenerating, provide intact forest floor to help minimize erosion, and to carry over or lifeboat some of the species until the new stand regenerates. And in particular, this is for some of the very small species like soil bacteria and fungi, and to also help provide some landscape level connectivity. Strategies 2 and 3 are to retain patches of snags and individual fire-resistant trees, whether these are alive or dead. And these fire-resistant trees in the Kootenays include Western Larch, Ponderosa Pine, and Douglas Fir. And the rationale for these strategies includes the previous reasons given, as well as providing for large coarse-woody debris inputs. And I think the fire-resistant live trees are especially important because they help confer resilience on the regenerating stand if another fire is to sweep through. And as well, they provide a seed source to help reforest the regenerating stand. The fourth strategy is to protect riparian areas and manage them similarly to unburned riparian areas. Dead trees in riparian areas provide multiple benefits. Plus, there's a high risk of compaction on moist soils if salvage is not done on frozen ground. And we've also seen significant trouble with regeneration in riparian flats that were salvaged in the past due to both compaction and frost damage, as well as grass competition. But one of the challenges, really significant challenges we had in the East Kootenay following the 2017 fires was that significant windstorms followed these fires and blew down many of these trees. And we were uncertain if we should go in and salvage these areas, if they're in the riparian, because honestly, it looked like a complete mess, or if we should just leave it as it was. So in order to resolve this, I contracted a hydrologist, Dr. Ryan McDonald, to develop an innovative new riparian sensitivity model using our LIDAR data. And I won't go into the technical details here, but basically Ryan derived a digital elevation model from the LIDAR and then modeled riparian sensitivity using the known factors that influence riparian areas. And he produced a map that looks similar to the figure that you're looking at, where the highest or the most sensitive areas are shown in dark blue, and the colors get lighter as you move out towards the edges. And I then asked Ryan to simplify the output from this model so that we could apply it with our layout crews in the field. And he produced something like this, so that we had 3 different categories of sensitivity: low, medium, and high. And his guidance to us was to stay out of the medium and high categories, so keep those as reserves, but that we could salvage wood from the low category without having an impact on the hydrological system. So you can see here that in following that guidance, we end up with very much of a variable width buffer surrounding the stream. And this is just a picture of the White River and the Kootenays. If anyone's on the call from the Kootenays, you may recognize this. And the red square around the map corresponds to the area that's roughly shown in the photograph from the helicopter. You can see that a large portion of this area was considered to be either highly sensitive or moderately sensitive. And I think there was maybe a little fringe area that we took in here, but for the most part, all of this was retained, despite a fair bit of the blowdown in here. And a lot of this actually blew down afterwards, but we still left it for ecological reasons. I won't go into detail on the remaining strategies, except to emphasize that they are all very important and have detailed components associated with them. And we developed detailed best management practices for both our operational and our planning folks. But the last one, number 8, leads into the next project that I'll speak about, because it speaks to intact drainages with high values and refuges for sensitive species like grizzly and wolverine. And this next project is the identification of high conservation value areas within the East Kootenay. Now, HCVAs, as they're known, are a key component of Forest Stewardship Council certification, which has been held by Canfor East Kootenay since 2003. Defined as areas of exceptional ecological or cultural value, ecological HCVAs are based on 3 categories: concentrations of biodiversity, including rare, threatened, and endangered species and endemics; large landscape level forests, or ecosystem mosaics and intact forests; and rare, threatened, or endangered ecosystems and habitats. And in order to identify these, again, I struck a collaborative team, including species experts, government and environmental groups, and industry folks. And the Indigenous nations identified their own cultural HCVAs separately, building on the ecological ones. Under category 1, a large component deals with listed species and their habitat on global, national, provincial, and regional levels. And for each of these species, there were 51 of them in the East Kootenay, we obtained digital data on their habitats, or had species experts identify this for us. Category 1 also deals with values such as endemism, or species that only occur within the area, concentrations of vertebrates, such as might occur within the Columbia wetlands during migration, migratory habitat, refugia, and concentrations of biodiversity values. For this last one, we considered known factors impacting biodiversity, such as broadleaf and veteran trees, as well as riparian areas, wetlands, and old and mature forests. Category 2 relates to large landscape level forests. And under FSC, these are typically defined as areas with no modern anthropogenic disturbance that are 50,000 hectares or greater. But since that size threshold would essentially exclude or any of the intact drainages in the East Kootenay, we simply looked at watersheds with no or low road density. So Greg Utzig, who was working with us, did an analysis and identified them based on the various categories that you see here. Category 3 included red and blue listed plant communities, such as the high elevation grasslands in the Elk Valley, rare ecosystems, which we defined as being those with less than 2,000 hectares in the Kootenays, old and mature forests, where these age classes are becoming rare due to human activities, as well as ecosystems that are underrepresented in protected areas. And both of the last two categories, there tends to be a real focus on the lower elevation systems. The dry IDF, the interior Douglas fir, our open range, open forest ecosystems, as well as the ICH that has been heavily harvested over really the past 100 years. So once we identified all these different values, we then assembled data for all of them in a GIS system. Some of them were determined to be high conservation value areas, all on their own. For example, habitat for species at risk, like caribou, or known bull trout spawning areas, or the most intact drainages. And others were identified based on high concentrations of values, where multiple values overlapped within the same area. An expert opinion and the consensus of the group was used to determine which areas qualified. And from this process, it resulted in 189 HCVAs. And for each one, I developed a management strategy to maintain or enhance the values within it. And for particular strategies such as grizzly bears, these were written in the association or with the help of experts, such as Dr. Michael Proctor for grizzly bears. And they were reviewed by the entire group. And as well, we've been doing ongoing monitoring in association with groups such as WildSite and the Tanaha to determine whether or not our strategies have been implemented and if they're being effective in the field. And where we've found that they're not being implemented fully or they're not being effective, we've then made modifications to those strategies. Now I'll jump to something a little bit different to lead into some of the more recent work that I've been doing. I have done, as I expect have many of you, telemetry studies on large mammals in order to do habitat selection studies to inform ungulate winter range orders and management. And these studies typically overlay telemetry points on our forest inventory data to determine which forest types animals are using and selecting for. However, the VRI has some major limitations, as any of you who have worked closely with it will know. The forest is mapped at a fairly coarse scale. Polygons range from 1 to 40 hectares in size, and there can be considerable variation within them. Because it doesn't have accurate stand structure data, the VRI is not well suited for determining biodiversity assessments, nor does it have residual tree data for cut blocks, which can have a significant effect on many of the birds, as we have seen. Ground closure, which is a key variable for many of the ungulates, is not projected through time, which becomes very problematic, and stand age is often not accurate. Because it's based on human photo interpretation, there can be a large degree of variation from one photo interpreter to another, and errors can occur. And finally, due to the updating process and historical errors, there are many examples of missing cut blocks, fires without attribute data, and our regenerating stands are not very well described. But what's the alternative, since the VRI is the best that we've got on a provincial scale? Well, LIDAR is a remote sensing technology which uses laser pulses from an aircraft to determine highly accurate coordinates of ground features. It provides very detailed depictions of terrain and vegetation. For example, if you compare the air photo with VRI polygons on the left with the LIDAR for individual trees themed by height for the same area on the right, you can see some significant differences. Focus on the pine polygon that the yellow arrow was pointing to. You can see that the VRI identified one very large contiguous polygon with a height of 19 meters. But for the same area, the LIDAR identified a range of heights. The light green 20 to 25 meter trees to the north, and the dark blue less than 15 meter tall trees to the south. And you can even pick out two individual trees greater than 30 meters in height. The orange dots are circled in red. And the terrain data is also vastly superior to the traditional trim. Comparing the two images above, you can see the difference that LIDAR would make to modeling escape terrain for mountain goats or bighorn sheep. So in light of the advantages that LIDAR brings, I initiated a collaborative project to assess LIDAR requirements, or ungulate winter range requirements rather, using LIDAR. And this was a collaborative project between Canfor and BCTS, with Foresight conducting the analysis and Flanneau also involved. The ungulate winter range order in the East Kootenay has requirements for snow interception cover, mature cover, and early seral foraging habitat. Cover requirements are specified by age and evergreen crown closure, as well as tree species in a couple of cases. Foraging requirements are specified by age, and best available information is to be used in order to assess the ungulate winter range requirements. So we set about determining the LIDAR or stand structure equivalent of the age and crown closure requirements. And the intent wasn't to develop different requirements, but just to take a look at what the equivalent was in terms of stand structure. In order to do this, we assessed the relationships among stand age, LIDAR height, and LIDAR canopy closure for each of the habitat types in the order, and then developed height and crown closure criteria that best approximated the early seral and cover definitions for each of the habitat types. There was actually some pretty detailed and tricky methodology that went into this, which you can read about in the reports, but I'm not going to go into the details here. But, whoops, jumped ahead. But the result was that we were able to define early seral, for example, shown here, by height and crown closure for each of the different habitat types. And these are essentially different productivity classes, if you will. And you can see that for each of these different classes, there were different criteria, like different height classes and different crown closure classes, reflecting the different stands and species within each of those types. So you can see how we can get much more specific than just a simple age criteria applied right the way across the board. And when you go in and take a look at some of the mapped areas and investigate, well, which stands differed and which ones didn't, you start to see the reason for these differences. And, in many cases, it's simply a poor description of our early seral stands in the VRI. So the top figure there, the arrow is pointing to a polygon in the VRI. It says that the height of that stand was 3.9 meters in 2015. And yet the LIDAR, when it was measured, the actual height of that stand shows that it was 9.9 meters. And LIDAR is extremely accurate. I mean, down to the centimeter almost. So we know that that's just simply much, much better data. So under the criteria that were determined, that stand would then not count towards early seral. And so overall, the LIDAR detected less early seral than did the VRI, mainly for this reason. The other thing that we're using LIDAR for is to develop an index of old growth quality for our TFL 14 just south of Golden. And this is another project in collaboration with Foresight, where they're doing most of the heavy lifting in terms of the technical work with the LIDAR. And the objectives of this project are, again, through a collaborative group, which includes ourselves and Foresight, as well as Monroe Ecosystems. Deb McKillop, the regional ecologist, is providing key expertise here, as well as WildSite and the Tanaha. We're developing an old growth index using the LIDAR to stand structural variables and ranking and then mapping old and mature stands on the TFL. And an objective of this project is also to do some field checks. So it's not just the mapping, but also to go out in the field and actually kind of gut check this and see how well it's working as compared to, just using the VRI alone, for example. And then that check will also tell us if we need to do any adjustments. And then to use this new method to redeploy our spatial logmas to the best locations in consideration of other factors such as size and connectivity, etc. And it's a really good time for us to do this down here because we're transitioning from, we have been using an earlier version of the BEC, and we're now moving to the latest and greatest, which will be BEC 12. And this actually has significant implications on our TFL, as it does in many other parts of the East Kootenay. So to start with, we calculated descriptive statistics from the LIDAR to describe forest structure within 20 by 20 meter cells. And you can calculate all sorts of different things. This just shows a variety of the different ones that we were taking a look at. And then because LIDAR does not have age in it, and age is the thing that we really needed to ground train the data to, we used ground data from TEM plots. These were existing TEM plots that were collected a while ago to train the LIDAR data to structural stage using machine learning. Ideally, we would have had a full set of ground plots where we poured trees and had the actual ages of a lot of individual trees to use as the training data set, but we didn't have that. So the next best thing that was available was this TEM data set. So we used this in a machine learning program called Random Forest, and consistent with many other studies that have done similar work, tree height and various derivations of this variable was found to be the strongest predictor of structural stage. The other ones that came up were sort of vertical height diversity. So like standard deviation of height, as well as mean crown diameter. And these variables were then used in a model to rank all of the stands that were greater than 80 years old within the TFL, producing the map you see on the left. And for field truthing, we then aimed to visit some of the best and next best ranked stands within each of the 4 BEC variants on TFL. And an example map on the right just shows what that looked like for the ESSF. And we're trying to focus on, the darkest red stands there were some of the best that we went to go and visit. And what our field checks showed, we spent a few days in August as a group, a collaborative group, was that in general, LIDAR was better than the VRI due to errors in the VRI. For example, we found one area that was mapped as an AUGMA in our existing AUGMA set that had actually been harvested about 30 years ago. And for some reason, the VRI had just never been updated with that cut block. So that was a mistake. And we also found that the LIDAR rankings seemed to be fairly accurate in terms of our, very best and moderate. That relative ranking seemed to reflect what we saw in the field. The model definitely needed a little bit of tweaking to improve it, especially down in the ICH, which is right along the benches by the Columbia wetlands. And that area has an extensive history of logging and human use, and so some very complex stand structure, and not very many TEM plots to ground truth it either. I think that was the real problem. So I'm not quite sure how we're going to fix that, to be honest. But well, we need to try and take a look at that. And if we can, we'll try and refine this model and then use it to redeploy our OGMAs, because certainly, even as it stands now, with some improvements needed, we could see that it is vastly better than our existing OGMA deployment. But the other thing that is really important to consider, at least to me, is not just the ranking of an individual stand, but some of the larger landscape context. So I already mentioned things like size and connectivity, but I think the placement of OGMAs relative to their probability of burning is absolutely critical. And maybe not so much in our TFL, which near Golden, it's wetter. And there's some very rugged topography up there, which may limit the number of large fires. But in many places in the province, especially down in the southeast here, we are seeing increased winter and spring precipitation. So we're getting more vegetation growth, but this is being coupled now with more frequent and longer summer droughts. So we've got a drier vegetation, and we're getting longer fire seasons and much hotter temperatures and stronger winds. And this is just leading to some extremely severe fires. And these more frequent and severe wildfires are expected to continue or increase. And in talking to the fire ecologists, they think that what we're seeing now is significantly outside the range of historic variability. Yes, maybe some of these fires did occur in the past, but certainly not so many as we are seeing now. And they're likely much more severe now than they were in the past. And combined with the increased forest insect pest levels, the management challenges we're facing now are unprecedented, in my opinion, for both forest and wildlife habitat management. And the very fact that Jasper National Park called in Canfor to conduct a large-scale fuel reduction project within the park is testament to these challenges. I think this would have been unfathomable 20 years ago, but they did call us in a couple of years ago, and we did conduct a very successful logging project to reduce the fuel hazard due to mountain pine beetle within Jasper. So in conclusion, I think, at least to me, business as usual in terms of forest management is simply no longer an option in the changing climate. And we all need to work together. Knowledge of many different types and expertise from many different disciplines is required in order to make good management decisions. We need input from our Indigenous nations, governments, industry, academia, our local communities, environmental groups, etc. And transparency and communication is really key, I think. The studies need to be done and the results put out there, and people need to be allowed to look at the results and view them and evaluate those. And from my perspective, I think there's many policy changes that need to be done in order to support good management for wildlife habitat. So I think I'll end there. Thank you very much. And I would be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Kari. Fantastic presentation. What a range of history and a scope of techniques and strategies that you've used. So appreciative. Thank you.